Welcome to the Cannaman podcast, hosted by Global Cannabinoid Solutions, the world's leading cannabis science firm and cannabis market entry specialists. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on this latest episode of Cannaman.
Record. Super. Well, thanks so much, Ruth. Welcome to another episode of the Cannaman podcast. My name is Christopher Tasker, and with me today, we've got the lovely Ruth Fisher, PhD. And so the reason I've very keen to interview Ruth and share Ruth's perspective on the cannabis industry, because she's got a rather unique background and perspective looking at it from the realm of economics. And so Ruth, unlike myself, has come in from there's an environment to be explored around cannabis, and I've come at cannabis sort of through the lens of the microscope, and Ruth's come at it with a very sort of global perspective, looking at incredible market factors and economic factors that I'm very new to, and I think a lot of people in the cannabis industry and for newcomers to cannabis are probably highly unaware of. And we were just talking a little bit before, Ruth, about sort of reality and ideologies and the goals that everyone has for the cannabis industry. And so we get quite a variety of perspectives and a lot of confusion there within. And so Ruth is going to walk us through some of those complexities and some of the confusion, I guess, and a lot of the fogginess that is maybe around cannabis and the different directions that we would like the industry to go, and the different directions that the market is heading. And so Ruth, I thought it'd be best to sort of look at your journey into cannabis so far, and maybe we start off by you introducing yourself and your sort of qualifications, and just how you've sort of found yourself in the center of the cannabis industry and speaking so passionately about it as well. So it'd be lovely to hear a bit about your journey into this world.
Thank you for inviting me here. I'm delighted at the opportunity. So I'm an economist, as you've said, and what I did before I entered the wild, wacky world of cannabis is I'm a systems person, and I look at systems dynamics, and I've been doing this mostly in technology systems, but also a lot in healthcare. And what I do is I look at a certain environment, and so you can take a certain technology system, and I ask, will this technology become adopted? And if not, how can we change that to, improve the chances of the technology getting adopted? And I look at value creation, how the technology is creating value for just different participants in the market, and how can we increase that value? And perhaps if we're the technology owner or developer, how do we extract more value? But if you think about, say, the internet, that's a very clear example, and that provides a lot of value to a lot of different people in a lot of ways. And initially, the internet came on and provides pretty open access to everyone. And there was this big, long battle trying to figure out how to monetize different technologies on the internet. So you have the search engines, and that's a really good example. Search engines, Google provides a tremendous amount of value pretty much to everyone, but you don't pay for it directly. You don't pay Google, every time you do a search, or you don't pay a monthly fee, but Google needs to pay the rent, and they need to pay their people. So how do they collect money, extract some of the value they're creating for people based on the value that they're creating for everyone? And so this is the type of dynamic I look at. And also, what fascinates me most is not only, say, technology introduction into a market, but how the market evolves over time, and trying to figure out, well, what's going to happen in the future, and where's this going to go? And we've all seen how, say, cell phones have taken on a life of their own, and they've definitely evolved over time, and they've ended up, shaping the way people interact with one another. And in response, the developers of the technology have changed the nature, the features, the benefits of the phones that shape people's behavior. And so it's kind of this it's a dance between, what the developers are doing, how people are receiving it and responding, and how developers are responding to that. And so this is kind of a technology culture interaction, but at the same time, all of the players are the evolution in the market is also dramatically shaped by the laws, the regulations. And so this is like a government aspect. And so the government has a lot of power to shape what people are doing, as far as, say, freedom of speech laws, censorship laws. To what extent are the technology owners responsible for the behaviors that their users undertake? And so the nature of these laws shape how people end up using the technologies, and they also shape the features and benefits that the technology providers add to those technologies. And then the last piece that I see, so we talked about very briefly culture and technology and law. There's another piece in there, and that's markets. And that's kind of, if you're a developer and creating a business, how do you, again, keep the lights on? What's your business model? What's cost effective for you to do or not to do? And so when I'm looking at an environment and considering how I think the situation is going to evolve over time, I look at these 4 pieces generally: the culture and how people interact with things, what they see as allowable or doable or expected of them, or not expected of them by the norms and values of society. Then you have the technology aspect. What are the available technologies and what can we do with them? You have the legal aspect, which is setting the laws and regulations, that's providing the infrastructure for all the different people and players to interact. And then the last one is the business environment that determines like what's cost effective to do. And so I've been looking at this, as I said, in technology systems and how technology interacts with society. I've also been very active in, at times, the healthcare system, although I get very frustrated. I call the healthcare system bumper cars from hell. Because you have so many different players coming from so many different perspectives, and they all seem to be acting at odds with one another. And so what I do is I try and model this situation. I figure out kind of, you have the pharma companies, you have the doctors, you have the patients, you have the administrators, you have all these different interest groups acting on the situation. And I try and figure out, well, how can we try and harmonize everyone to get their actions to be more in accordance to provide better outcomes? And so this would, if you're introducing a new product, you want to, harmonize the environment surrounding that product in order to maximize the value creation associated with it, and then also the value extraction by the consumers and the producers and whatnot. So that's a very long-winded way of describing kind of what I was doing before I came to cannabis. So my experience with cannabis has been very little. I tried it in college and decided it wasn't really my thing. I had heard in the early 90s about cannabis for medical or therapeutic purposes, and I thought that was just total BS. I remember thinking, well, if someone's sick, and it was coming out at the time, the early 90s, it was, you had huge grassroots movements for AIDS patients, advocating that cannabis be more widely available for AIDS patients. And I was working on a case involving a biotech drug for AIDS, and I was learning about how horrific the disease was, especially at the time. And it's interesting because the AIDS period at that time was kind of like we were with COVID maybe a year ago, where it was total chaos, total fear. No one knew kind of how to deal with it. And there was a lot of panic there. And in the midst of it, you had the AIDS patients who are really suffering, and the cannabis patients coming out saying they really need to have access to cannabis. And as I said at the time, I remember thinking, well, if they can get relief, if they want to get high and kind of escape their situation, then I really have no problem with that. But as far as cannabis really being a therapeutic, I totally dismissed the idea and hadn't really thought much about it. So fast forward ahead now, about 6 years ago, but around 2015, my brother was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And his multiple sclerosis, his MS, manifests as multifaceted pain. And he had been on a long journey to get diagnosed. And then even once he was diagnosed, struggling to deal with this illness, it was really horrific. And he was on all sorts of medications and nothing was really bringing him relief. And at some point, one of his doctors said, it was a neurologist, said, you know, I think you might be able to benefit from cannabis, but I can't give you any guidance. And so, you know, it's one more thing that my brother could try. He tried everything and he said, okay, well, you know, I'll give it a try. And he had used it before. And, you know, so he's like, well, how difficult can it be? Walked into a dispensary and very quickly realized that he had no idea what he was doing. He started playing around with it and experimenting, and he was actually getting some benefits. And at some point he came to me. And as I said, I've been very involved in healthcare and doing a lot of research. And so he said, you know, I'm using medical cannabis. And I'm like, really? And I was totally shocked by that. And I was perhaps even more shocked by the fact that he said, and I'm getting benefits. and he said, you know, I figure though, if I knew what I was doing, I could probably be getting more benefits from it. Yeah. Could you help me figure this out? And so at that point, as I said, I was really floored, but I knew what he had been going through and it was really hell. And at that point I said, okay, I know nothing about this and I'm just going to try and set aside my biases and just go and see what the literature says. And so I started a deep dive into research at that time and just started reading everything. And there's, as anyone knows who's delved into cannabis, there's a ton of information and it's really, really confusing. Now I'm a researcher and a market researcher, and I've done research on very, you know, specific markets and products and technologies and everything else. And I've never seen anything so complicated and difficult to understand as cannabis. And it took me a long, long time to kind of try to make sense of what I was seeing. And so while I'm doing the reading and I'm reading, you know, a lot of it started with real basic stuff like what is cannabis and getting all the basic sativa and indica stuff. What really rocked my world and totally changed the way I view everything was when I read about the endocannabinoid system. And
you're not the first to say that either, Ruth. That's like, that comes up every time in everyone's sort of journey into cannabis. It's so interesting. So please carry on. That's lovely to hear.
It, you know, so many things made sense after that because, you know, people new to cannabis come in and people are saying, well, it'll address your pain, it'll help you sleep, it will cure cancer, it will cure, you know, help you with your arthritis. And you're thinking, there's no way in hell one product can do anything like that.
It sounds like a lie. No, it is bizarre.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I can't pretend to understand cannabis at this point, even after reading, you know, delving, you know, being so immersed in the subject for over 6 years now. But it makes so much sense. And after understanding the pieces and kind of being able to put them together, it also makes a lot more sense. And kind of the interesting aspect to me. And so I started researching it, and my brother's among other things, he's an engineer, and he came up with an idea for technology. And this was, as I keep saying, 6 years ago, and it was very different then. It's amazing how quickly cannabis is evolving. But it very quickly became apparent that the big problem in cannabis is figuring out how to get the right products to the right people.
Yeah.
So an individual comes in and they have particular needs, and they need to understand which cannabis product will help them best address what they want to use it for. And so my brother came up with a technology for this. And so we started developing it, and my job was doing this matching. So developing these algorithms that could kind of take cannabis and take people with needs and put them together. And so then I started needing to provide a very coherent and interconnected understanding of how cannabis works in order to create these algorithms. And did this for a long time and was coming up with some really, really good stuff. And at some point, my brother said, wow, you know, we've collected so much information, we really should put it together for other people to use and benefit from. So at that point, we released our medical cannabis primer, and that was in 2019. So we're really proud of that. We think it's wonderful. But at the same time, you know, everything's still moving. And so, as I said, after understanding kind of the complexity and the different perspectives on cannabis, it really helped me process what was going on. And in particular, whenever I come across new information, it becomes much easier to understand or kind of integrate it into my, body of knowledge. And so just very quickly, some of the bigger interest groups you have in cannabis is you have obviously the legacy cannabis people. And so you have the legacy growers, often called the OG culture. And with them, you have the rec crowd and the medical crowd. You also have the alternative or holistic medicine people. And they're the ones who have been very strongly involved in the grassroots support and movements towards medical cannabis. And kind of at the other extreme, you have the traditional healthcare industry. And they're coming from like the big pharma, the pharma perspective. And doctors trained in Western medicine, they're very well trained. And they're very clearly trained in this is how we do modern medicine. And modern medicine is done using isolates. And it's done based on a large body of research that's done in support of a medicine so that the community understands very well the efficacy and in most cases, the mechanism of action, how the drug is working. And in cannabis, none of that really exists. And so in traditional medicine, they say we use an isolate and we have plenty of guidelines. And here in the US, it's supported by the FDA. You have all the clinical trials and that provides a body of information. The FDA approves the drug and the body of evidence has clear guidelines. So any doctor who wants to prescribe the patient or guide patients in the use can turn to the FDA and get all this information to help them determine which patients would best benefit, how much to give them, what types of things to look for. And so the medical community, the traditional medical community, when they're coming at cannabis, this is what they're looking for. And obviously that's not there because cannabis hasn't been legal. So it hasn't been accepted into the medical community. So despite the fact that it might have wanted to comply with these kinds of standards or regulations, it hasn't been able to. It's been locked out of the system. And that's, I won't say one thing or other, that's just the fact of it. So you have the medical community looking for stuff from cannabis that doesn't exist. Then you have like the social justice movement, which is people coming at it, and you have traditional recreational users who are out there. And these are the people who are providing the early knowledge about cannabis. And you go and these are the people who are providing the really, really good, insightful information about how to grow good cannabis, how to process, how to extract it. Then you have, you have very interesting dichotomies there because you have medical users versus recreational users, and they're coming at it from very different places and they're finding it very difficult to talk to one another. And in particular, my brother had a very interesting experience because when you think of, say, legacy cannabis and the way that it was classically used, it's very much a social product. And you have the like puff, puff, pass and the community of users. And when you go out and when you look for cannabis, if you look at the descriptions, this one produces a heady high with, an aroma. It's kind of like wine in a sense, but it's very involved as far as the consumption process. And when my brother walked into the dispensary and he was trying to find a product to meet his needs to help reduce his pain, he said the bud tender was telling him, well, this will give you this type of high and make you feel this way. And my brother's like, I just want to get it into my body as quickly as possible and start feeling the benefits. And that's a different perspective. And it's a different, completely set of different needs. And so you have the medical community and the medical users and the bud tenders are not really talking to each other. They're missing each other. So these are some of the groups. And then you have, of course, you have the regulators, and the regulators they have two primary concerns. The first is making sure that no one who shouldn't be involved in cannabis activity is involved in cannabis activity. So they're trying to prevent children using it, and they're trying to prevent, obviously, black market activity. The other thing the regulators care about is making sure they're getting all their tax money. And so they come in and they're setting their laws according to these two end goals. And the laws often conflict with what the market is able to do. And so another big tension in the market is the legal market versus the black market.
Right.
And cannabis, I'm here in California, which is one of the largest, black markets in the world that has been around for decades. And when you have the legal markets are trying to, they're trying to create and sustain a profitable business in the face of all the regulations are killing them because they're massively increasing the cost of doing business.
Yeah.
They're doubling or tripling the prices. And the people in the black market aren't subject by their very nature. They're not legal. They're not bound by the laws. So they don't have to pay all the costs of compliance, the security costs, the reporting costs, the labeling costs, everything else. And so they can charge much lower prices. So governments keep coming in and raising the taxes and they're pricing the legal market out of existence. So, and then you have, it just keeps getting more and more complicated.
There's so many layers to it, isn't there?
Yeah.
And everything you said, Ruth, all of this parallels over to the UK, which is also so interesting. Like, you'd think that we could be talking about the exact same place, just with how the processes worked and how the that evolution sort of happened. It's almost like, well, there's a problem, we'll react accordingly. But the same issues and parallels have emerged over here. And it's really just, I'm sure for like someone that's English listening to this or someone that's in Europe or Britain, they'll be going, well, it's the exact same over here. And we're just making the same mistakes and seeing the same groups sort of just brush up against each other. And it, to make the sort of biological comparison, it's like an organism almost at the end of the day. And the way you were talking about the sort of market and its evolution and the sort of systems behind all that, it's very much like an organism in a way, sort of living organism. And the way you were talking about that, sorry, sounded like the way we talk about cells and biology and things like that. So it's all very much alive and growing, but it's just not hilarious, but it's just funny to hear how similar it is on completely other like continents almost. So
yes
maybe it's the human element as well, and the culture, or I don't know what element of the sort of environment that would be or ecosystem that would be, but maybe it's tech.
There's a term for this. There's a term for this. It's a complex adaptive system.
Okay.
And any living being, any economy, any market, any social system is a complex adaptive system. It's inherently unpredictable and it has certain features. Everything's very interdependent. What one person does affects what other people do and how they react, and that causes reactions again. So you get reverberations, and this is how the system evolves.
It's really interesting because I've got written down here just like notes and themes, and I've written like intersecting, evolution, it's all very biological and like, I guess at the end of the day, like evolutionary in a sense. And organic, exactly. So it's interesting, just there's a lot of interesting themes sort of emerging again, even from a like economic and sort of medical realms.
And it's interesting because if you go back to the 4 systems that I initially talked about, you have a lot of like culture and bias and values wrapped up. You have a lot of technology. You have all the government laws and regulations, and you have the business environment. I will very quickly add 2 more tensions that I think that you're going to relate to, but I think are massively shaping the market. Is initially you started out and everything was mom and pop. And so very small growers, very small businesses, all the boutique stuff, the craft stuff, the artisan stuff. And as cannabis started gaining momentum, they grew and they scaled. And now you have the bigger players, the MSOs, the multi-state operators here, and they're almost turning against traditional cannabis in that they have very different interests. They're trying to develop monopolies. And cross-state, very large organizations. And then, so a lot of those are legacy cannabis people who grew into big cannabis. And then the last group and it's not the last, but the last one I'll mention that's really, really huge, are now all the especially big business coming in that are the non-cannabis people who are looking to totally revolutionize cannabis, say the big beverage companies,
Okay.
big alcohol, big beer. You have the cigarette companies coming in, they're pivoting to cannabis. And so they're bringing a very, very different flavor to cannabis. And there's a lot of tension there between what they want to do, you know, make everything a Budweiser or Coors, mass consumption on a very large scale, versus, you know, the craft growers who are looking at, you know, very specific experiences. So yeah, there's just a lot going on.
We are seeing a good spread of that. I remember a couple of years ago, there was a massive just influx of everyone was making a CBD drink in some way, shape or form. And I don't know how many of those are around now, but since then, it's only the companies that have gained interest in that area have just been bigger and bigger and bigger. And so whether it be sort of other floral extracts and botanical molecules, aromatic substances that you can aren't as heavily regulated, it seems as it just, again, going back to the organic nature, there seems to be a lot maybe a bit of a growth in organic businesses as well, and organic products in those realms. But for what we've talked about here, a lot of it's been quite Europe and US focused and North American focused. For say Africa and Asia, do you expect the same sort of and South America as well, do you expect the same sorts of progressions, or given their different cultures, do you think there'll be different progressions, should I say, Ruth?
So one of the things that I tried to do very early on is develop so here in the States, we have the United States, is, you know, it's like Europe, in that Europe is composed of, you know, different specific countries. And we have the States here. And because of the Schedule 1 classification of cannabis, THC isn't allowed to pass state lines.
Yeah.
So we have individual markets here, just like you do there. But each state is essentially its own country. And any activity involving cannabis, now this is when I say cannabis, I mean really marijuana or THC products, as opposed to the CBD or hemp products.
Right.
So anything with THC in it, any activity, it has to be grown, processed, manufactured, distributed, sold, and consumed within the state.
Okay.
And each time a new market comes online, it's a whole new market that's completely separate. Not completely, because now you're getting the multi-state operators, but essentially you don't get communication across state lines, and each state has very different laws and regulations regarding what can and can't be done. And that's creating a ton of confusion, but that's a separate issue in itself. But so one of the issues here, and I'm sure you're going to see it in Europe as well, is so a new state comes online. And that means, as I said, all the activity has to be done within the state, and all the activity has to be licensed. And so you have generally a new state comes online, they figure out what the rules are, and then they issue licenses to grow, to process, to distribute, and to dispense.
Right.
And you can see and the laws are very different as far as whether or not one person can own a combination of different licenses, or how many licenses each person can own. So those laws are very different across states. But if we look at those licenses, and then you have a market develops, we all know that there's big money in cannabis, and trying to get those licenses to be able to engage in that activity is a highly valuable endeavor. And there's a lot of, you know, political lobbying going on and strategic maneuvering around getting the licenses. And once the licenses are established, in creating that industry. And in particular, let's talk about cultivation. So as I said, every state, they have to, you know, support their own activity. So any cannabis consumed in California has to be grown in California. Any cannabis consumed in Montana has to be grown in Montana.
Right.
Any cannabis grown in Alaska has to be, any consumed in Alaska has to be grown in Alaska. Now, there obviously, this is agriculture, and different products flourish in different areas. And one of the reasons that cannabis is so big in California is it has these ideal grow environments. And you have a couple other areas in the country that are really good. It's the tobacco areas especially. But so, in each market, cannabis in California is I believe, $3 billion. I don't know what it is in Alaska, but I imagine it's a lot more expensive to grow cannabis in the middle of the snow than it is to grow it in the Emerald Triangle in California, where it's naturally, the conditions are natural for it to flourish there. And so you have these people in Alaska who have gotten the licenses to cultivate cannabis for the state of Alaska. And they've now had to invest a lot of money in, say, greenhouse grow operations, all the lighting, all the technology, all the tracking and trace and everything else. And that's really, really expensive. And there's, I'm sure, a lot of political play going on there. So now they build up their market, and they now have tens of millions or more invested in their grow market. What happens when the borders open and all of a sudden it's legal for cannabis to flow through borders? So if there were no other restrictions, no legal requirements, no anything else, you would tend to see more cannabis grown in the naturally fertile areas, and having those areas export to the places where it's more difficult or costly to grow. But Alaska, after having invested tens of millions or more in cultivating cannabis, do you really think the state, the politicians there and the businesses who own those grow operations, do you really think they're going to open up and let their businesses be driven out by stuff that grows, say, in Africa for, I don't know what the price is there. I have an acquaintance in cannabis who I believe he said he expects it to go down to $1 a kilogram.
Wow. Okay. That's impressive.
So there's obviously a tension there. And so how are the laws, in the state? The federal government might say, okay, we bless all the cannabis sales. They can now flow across state lines, or in your place, across country lines.
Yeah.
Once, UK or Germany or whoever has invested all their money, are they really going to allow some other country to come in and put them out of business?
Yeah. Very interesting, Ruth, because I again, going back to that sort of reality and ideology sort of conversation that we had earlier on, there's a lot of, and again, depending on what side you are, you've likely got you're closer to the functioning of the systems and the functioning of the functioning of the systems in place. So you've got a better idea of what pieces of the chessboard need to move in order to position and maneuver. And so for those newer and more emerging areas where that's maybe not been mapped out so well, what sort of, again, do you think it'll be that similar sort of evolution? And we'll see that is licensing the way that regional groups sort of rein in a area and take control over that market? Because that, I guess, seems to be the sort of, that's what I'm understanding from it, is that obviously at political level, governmental level, licensing is a way to regulate and tame that. But like you've said previously, the black market can always sort of underpin that or outcompete with that. And so going back to the harmony that we've talked about as well, where's that going to fall eventually? Like at the end of the day, I could go and grow a plant in my garden. It's incredibly hard to regulate that. And with it being as simple as putting a seed in the ground, anyone in the country could do that. And so the enforcement of that regulation and the laws and the licensing, and there's all of these murky areas, again, just because it's in law, there's the actual then enforcement of that and the practicalities of that. And so where do you sort of see that harmony falling, I guess, Ruth, in long term? And that's a very hard question. I guess, again, regionally, that's going to be quite interdependent, but
Oh, there was a point that I wanted to make when I was going off on all that, and I'll make that very quickly, and that kind of plays into what you're talking about right now. And so, as I was saying, each state is essentially a separate country here in the US as far as its cannabis activity goes. And we have new markets coming online every year. And so they vote to open up to cannabis. And so I tried to come up with this model predicting when a new market opens up, what would be the cannabis potential? How much in sales do we think we're going to see? And this kind of goes back to these four separate forces, or what's causing things to happen or evolve. And it turns out, so each market is a completely different environment. And when we are moving from state to state, it's pretty much like moving from country to country in Europe. And that each country has a very distinct culture and very distinct attitudes. And when you think about things, for example, so cannabis is a recreational product, among other things. And you see other engage in when they're recreating. And so places that have certain types of closer substitutes to cannabis, so places that drink more are probably going to, drink more alcohol, are going to tend to probably use more cannabis, all else equal.
Right.
And you start going into the different states, and they're really, really different. Each state is like a different country. And so the nature, the attitudes, the culture, whether it's a tourist nation or not, you look at Las Vegas, Las Vegas is a huge market for cannabis because they get all the tourists. And you have certain areas as well in like the Northeast. But if you look at places where you have more outdoor activity, you tend to see more cannabis activity. Or when you see maybe a healthier population of people are into, cannabis as a wellness product, then they're going to be more into cannabis. And so, trying to reconcile what's going to happen after the markets open up, or when new markets open up, it's going to be very individual from place to place, and you're not going to see a uniform thing. So kind of one of the things I concluded is I was looking at the cannabis use in the different states and say, okay, well, Mississippi, and I don't know how much people know about Mississippi, but and no disrespect to people from Mississippi, but it's a Southern culture. And it's very different from, say, California, as far as the lifestyles of the people, what they do on a day-to-day basis, the jobs people have, whether or not they go to church, what they do for recreation, all this stuff is drastically different from California. And California, and especially like Colorado and Washington, they're very high cannabis use places. So the question is once Mississippi comes up and gets online and opens up to cannabis, are they going to end up using as much cannabis per person as people in California? And the answer is probably not, because they're doing other things. They have different values, they have different attitudes, and they see the world differently. Okay. And so now going back to ideologies or government regulations, as I said, each state is regulated very differently. It turns out that the nature of the regulations have a massive, massive impact on the way the industry is organized, the way firms compete and whatnot. And I can give you a couple of different examples. So actually it was fascinating. When I first got into cannabis, I was studying the evolution of cannabis technology. And I'm really, really interested in science and technology. And I was looking at kind of, how it evolved over time. So what happened here in the States is cannabis was, came to the US around the 1850s, early 1900s. And then you had an early culture of use by certain, very specific populations. In the 60s, the 50s, it was a little bit of activity. In the 60s, you get the Cultural Revolution, and then you get the Controlled Substance Acts, which made it illegal around 1970.
Yeah.
So now what happened is in 1970, so this is very interesting. So in California was an early use state, again, because of the culture and just the nature of the people here. It came into California, and all the cannabis was coming from Mexico, and all the high quality cannabis was coming from Mexico. And there was essentially no domestic market. If you had homegrown weed, it was considered total crap. The only reason you used it is because you couldn't get the Mexican stuff.
Right.
So what happened in 1970 is the government started its war on drugs, and it cracked down and it worked with the Mexican government to close the border to prevent inflows of cannabis. So now all of a sudden the market is cut off. And so what happens is you force a domestic grow market. So you started getting cultivation there, and these people, you know, were very determined to do it right, and very quickly came up with really, really high quality cannabis. They started crossbreeding the good stuff from Mexico, and at some point stuff came in from India. You have the sativas from Mexico are crossing with the Indias from India, and they're getting these plants that are growing in the right temperature, in the right region with a certain mix. And so now they're flourishing, and now the cannabis in California is now the good stuff, and the stuff from Mexico, to the extent it makes it in, is not the good stuff. But then they're now it's still illegal, so they're hiding it, say, within other crops. They're going into mountain and forest areas, and they're growing cannabis in the middle. So then what happens is the government starts flying helicopters over these areas to locate the grow regions. So what that did is that forced all the cannabis out of the mountaintops and into basements. And what happens in basements is you need lighting. So, and you need hydroponics.
Yeah.
And so you started forcing development of technologies to be able to grow cannabis in closets and in basements. Then what happened is, it was interesting, you get this flourishing, this is in the 70s, you get this flourishing environment, a mail order business. So now you can buy all your seeds, you can buy all your products through mail order. So the government went out and started like busting these industries, getting their mailing addresses, and then checking on people. And I guess you can't do an unauthorized search. And one of the things they were doing is, when you have all this lighting in the basement, because it's dark, it's not outdoors, you get huge energy bills.
Yeah.
So then the government's coming in and monitoring the energy bills of the businesses. So what does that do? That forces low energy use technology.
Yeah, yeah. Going back to saying evolution and adapting, and yeah, very interesting. It's so going, just for people that don't know about this sort of cannabis war almost that sort of happened, I guess, federally in California. Was the Emerald Triangle sort of scenario, is it, that you're referencing? So the northern parts of California, where there's a lot more space, a lot more forestry, and a lot more higher capacity to avoid detection, should I say?
Well, I don't know if it's a capacity to avoid detection. The Emerald Triangle is in Northern California. It's not as far north as the border with Oregon, but it's north of San Francisco. So it's like the top 1/3 or so of the state, and the state is really, really, really long. You can drive like 12 hours north to south, and you're still in the state. You can drive across Europe almost for the size of California. But you have this area in California. It's very agriculture. It's very lush forest, and it's a very rich, perfect environment for growing cannabis.
Perfect conditions for it. Okay. And just up the road as well then. Okay, so yeah, I remember seeing a documentary when I was a teenager about the Emerald Triangle and all of the police. I think there was even TV shows about it, that the government might have brought out on PBS or something like that we were watching. That was just like how militarized it became, and it really became a bit of a drug war, it seemed like, with like sending helicopters into your own woodlands to hunt down.
Yeah. Well, this kind of goes back, and I was talking about how the nature of the regulations shaped the activity. And so the way that law enforcement was carried out changed the way that cannabis evolved. And so another law that shaped cannabis is, at some point, you had a lot of, cocaine and other drugs coming up from Mexico and in from Colombia and stuff. And you also had marijuana. At some point, what the police departments did is they said to the police, if you bust marijuana, you can seize the assets.
Right.
So if there's a house, if there's money, if there's cars, you can keep those funds or maybe a portion of the funds to fund your actions. And the police said, well, cannabis is generally more peaceful, less violent than cocaine.
Yeah.
And it's just easier to do. And so it essentially got them to focus on cannabis, instead of cocaine.
The term low-hanging fruit comes to mind, and it again,
yeah,
in a less extreme way, same in the
Yeah.
UK, we tend to target
Yeah.
cannabis users as the drug
right.
enemy of choice, and with that, lots of patients as well. But it's interesting, like just how, again, the parallels, Ruth, are just quite hilarious.
Yes. Now, the last one I will say, and I'm not as familiar with England, but I'm a free market economist, and I believe in as little regulation as possible. At the same time, I do understand that certain markets need some degree of regulation, and I would not advocate no regulation in cannabis. And in particular, I've studied, how cannabis works on the body therapeutically, and it's very in your brain. You have more cannabinoid receptors than all other receptor types combined. So cannabis activity is densely occurring in your brain. And for people who are young and their brains are still developing, using cannabis can mess with the development of your brain. And your brain is still developing until you're, depending on each person, around your early 20s. So I'm not saying that young people should never use it, because if you have serious other problems, then having potential cognitive issues, the risk of that is worth the benefit of, say, addressing epilepsy or addressing some other issues. But I think it should be regulated and not necessarily freely accessible to young people, because it can cause damage. There's other issues about regulating the nature of the activity. I can't say that I've thought a lot about which activity. Oh, okay. So another one is cannabis can be extremely therapeutic, and it can also be a wonderful product to use recreationally, but it can also be toxic. And I believe very strongly cannabis is a bioaccumulator, which means when you put it in the soil, it sucks up anything that's else in the soil. And they could potentially use it, to detoxify, as an environmental catalyst to suck up bad stuff in the soil. But any cannabis plant can have heavy metals in it. It can have pesticides. It can have toxins. And there are laws here in the States around testing. And I think that should be one of the laws, is that cannabis should be tested, required to be tested, to make sure it's actually safe to use.
There's a big focus on the THC element in that as well, with testing in particular. I think, well, for the UK, sorry, Ruth, to interject, when we say testing, people tend to just look at the cannabinoid elements and go, oh, well, look, the THC levels are too high, rather than, well, alongside that is also high levels of pesticides and heavy metals, or anything else in between, and mold, for example, we're maybe not measuring.
There's two primary things. When you have basic levels of testing, and as I said, the regulations are different, and each state requires testing for different things. The first thing everyone tests for is level of THC. And THC is important because that distinguishes whether it's cannabis or hemp. And they're regulated very, very, very differently. So as long as the THC level is not above a certain threshold, then you don't really need to do anything else with it. Once you've established that you do have THC there, then it's here in the States, or at least in many states, then you're required to test also for, and they give a specific list of pesticides, molds, toxins, metals, or whatever. And each state has a different list. Now, as far as, so those are the minimum requirements. I believe, I focus primarily on medical use. And if you're a medical patient, then you want very specific compounds in there. So it's kind of like, when you go, I haven't been to a UK store here. If you go to a grocery store here and you decide you want, say, chips, or potato chips, or breakfast cereal, you go and you get, for your breakfast cereal, you have a whole aisle. I mean, you got to have like 100 different types of breakfast cereal. So cannabis is like breakfast cereal. It's like, do you want sugar? Do you want oats? Do you want shredded wheat? Do you want raisins? Do you want nuts? In cannabis, you want for specific therapeutic purposes, you want very specific ingredients to be in there. And so I advocate for testing for all the different cannabinoids and terpenes also in the plant. But that's now, they generally require THC and CBD, and then maybe THCA and CBDA, but there's, they keep finding more different compounds we care about. There's roughly, depending on who you talk to, 200 different cannabinoids, roughly 200 different terpenes. And then you have like flavonoids and other stuff. So there's a whole lot of stuff that could potentially be tested for. And I think that over time they will test for more. But I think that there's at least a good handful of ingredients that also should be tested in addition to the THC and also in addition to all the toxins.
In mainstream cannabis conversations, or in say the average news article, you probably won't get that readout of, well, you often don't get beneath the skin of CBD and THC ratios. No one's talking about, oh, what flavonoids are also in there, what terpenes are also in there. And so like there's thousands of molecules, but it's so strange that we're fixated on THC as that marker of just morality and medicinality and everything in between. So for those moving forward and in the sort of current sphere as you see it, what's the momentum at the moment, Ruth? Is there hopes for, and I say hopes, like, are we moving towards a more liberalized view of cannabis nationally in the US, do you think? Or do you think we're very much sort of, and those smaller nations and states are setting themselves up for their own sort of independent view and the federal government will sort of sit back? Or do you think these organisms will all merge together and it'll become part of a larger national conversation? Like, how do you sort of, like, where are things moving in your view at the moment?
I think it's being more accepted. There's still definitely stigma, but as it becomes a bigger part of society, I believe that it is being more accepted. You're seeing more and more people. So when after I wrote my book, I'll go around and, every time I have a conversation with people, it's just some odd person. So, in the grocery store, or if I happen to go to the doctor, or, anything I'm talking about, I'll say, oh, but, do you know anything about cannabis? And they're like, I use cannabis, or someone told me, or my friend uses cannabis, or my mother-in-law uses cannabis. And it's interesting because it's one of those things where you don't think anyone's using it, but when you start bringing it up, everyone seems to be using it, or they know someone who's using it. And I think that, and I just wrote this morning on a LinkedIn post, I think that the big difference between alcohol and cannabis is simply common knowledge and exposure. And so alcohol has just always been there. It's always been a part of life. You see it for better or worse. You see plenty of people using it responsibly. You see people using it irresponsibly. You see what the problems are when people use it irresponsibly, and it does cause problems, but it's just an accepted part of society. And I think that with cannabis, there's a hell of a lot of people out there using it, but no one knows about it. People don't know that their doctor or their boss or their colleagues or their, acquaintances, they don't know that all these people are using it. And these are people who they respect. And at the same time, they've been told that if you use cannabis, you're going to become an addict. You're going to have schizophrenia, you're going to have brain damage, you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your marriage, you're going to lose your kids. And so they don't know that it's being used responsibly. And at the same time, it's this amorphous thing that's just causing fear. And it's the devil you don't know. And I think that if it were more exposed and more people were vocal about using it, and it's becoming that way, where people are like, oh, I've been trying cannabis for sleep or for pain, it's helping my arthritis, it's helping me sleep, whatever. And you look at these people and you're like, that's grandma, or that's my boss or a colleague or someone I respect. And hey, if they can use it and, they're not going nuts, they're not robbing, I
Maybe
think
there's
that,
hope. It can be
yes,
sensibly,
yeah.
yeah.
And at the same time, there's a larger and larger younger group of people who've grown up in an environment that has less colored by the stigma. And so I think that we are moving in the right direction. And I think that, as a student of social history and looking at evolution over time, things always take way, way, way longer than you would think they would. I mean, you're talking decades and centuries. Whereas people today are like, why isn't it legal? It needs to be legalized next year. Things don't move that fast. But I think we are definitely moving forward. And I think as markets become established, it's going to spread more quickly to other places, or at least I hope access is, because the one thing that I've taken away from cannabis is the magnificent potential of this plant to help so many people. And when I first kind of realized the potential of cannabis, my first sense was an overwhelming sensation of sadness and disappointment that for decades, so many people have been prevented from having access to it.
Where can people read more about your work, Ruth? What website should people look out for? I'll put all the description, or all the links in the description, of course, but where can people find and follow you and keep track of your work?
I'm on LinkedIn, and I'm always very excited to meet new people there and connect. I have 2 different blogs. I have one on the site for my book, The Medical Cannabis Primer. And I have a blog there that deals with the medical and therapeutic aspects of cannabis. And then I have a separate website, Quanta, QUANTAA.com. And that's my market dynamics website. And there I have blogs on the social dynamics and market dynamics of cannabis in society and how that's evolving and changing over time.
Very, very interesting, Ruth. I've been, to be honest, I've been kind of blown away by the parallels between sort of biology and ecology, economics, and just how a market moves, how nature moves, biology moves. There's quite a strange number of parallels, and yeah, harmony and homeostasis, and just finding like those balances between groups and yeah, systems is really quite interesting and quite remarkable, really. It's yeah, sort of blown me away, and I was really keen for everyone else to get a taste of the sort of economics of cannabis, as well as I focus quite heavily on more of the medical side and the maybe some of the social side as well, but from a market perspective and a big sort of holistic, zoomed out macro view, this has been really interesting, and I think for a lot of people probably quite insightful as to how these different elements intertwine and intersect, and the interdependencies that you mentioned as well. So it's really really appreciate your time, Ruth, and for taking us all through this sort of mad ecosystem that we're sort of sat in at the moment. And I'm sure we'll keep doing more conversations and sort of trying to help people cut through some of the craziness. But yeah, really appreciate your time, Ruth. And yeah, make sure to go and follow all of Ruth's work. And I'll put some links to the Medical Cannabis Primer and all of her work, and LinkedIn as well. And so you can speak with Ruth directly and learn more about her work. But yeah, thank you so much, Ruth. Really, really appreciate you sharing your perspective.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Knowledge. And yeah, if there's other questions or if things come up, yeah, I'm sure Ruth would be very pleased to hear from you. And yeah, thank you so much for sitting and talking us through that. So very much appreciated, Ruth. We'll go and enjoy our Christmases and see each other in the new year. But otherwise, have a beautiful, hope everyone's enjoyed this information as much as I have, and hope everyone finds it useful. But yeah, thanks so much, Ruth.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy holidays.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Cannaman podcast. For more information on how you can safely navigate the cannabis ecosystem, take a look at some of our educational materials or reach out to us at www.globalcannabinoidsolutions.com. We look forward to you joining us on the next episode of the Cannaman podcast.